in the code and infrastructure that's the problem.
So let me just jump in here for a second, and again, I'm going to remind everybody, cameras on, so that way we can all see and we can kind of vote and all the rest of the things that we like to do. I don't know, Martino, if we have our question URL up, I think that would be useful. And I'm kind of curious if anybody here feels that they are expert at logging. Anybody? Show of hands. Anybody really thinks that they've got logging under control? Got a lot of us here. Nobody. Not one person that I can see, unless you got your camera off. Okay. So, yeah, nobody? Anybody? Nobody kind of jumping in here saying, hey, I really know logging? Okay, so Eric, this is your audience, right?
Cool.
You got a bunch of developers here. Yep, we hear you good.
Okay, cool. All right, well, cool. Thanks for jumping on the call, everyone. So I guess I'll just walk you guys walk through a little bit about Sentry. Let me see if this is always the tricky bit as to whether the screen share will work properly today. Let's see. There we go. So can you guys see this?
Yep.
Is it like full screen for you guys now?
It is.
Okay, cool. So this is the very, very basic outline. So obviously, Sentry, first question I really want to address, I think this is a common question, basically, how is Sentry different from logging itself? Are you guys mostly familiar with Sentry? Or is this pretty new for you guys?
I think there's one project that kind of uses it that you guys have identified, but I think the audience generally is comfortable with logging, but not as familiar with Sentry.
Okay, sure. So, so I think the first thing to clear up sort of is when is the cases when you use logging versus when are the cases you use Sentry? I think the first thing is always you can use logging instead of Sentry. It's always possible. It's always possible to use something like Splunk or the Elk Stack to sort of diagnose problems just like Sentry. The main thing is that error logging or crash reporting is really built around the idea that when an error happens in production and not in development, a lot of times you sort of don't know exactly what has happened. This is sort of like something the customer has triggered that is a little more niche. And so a lot of it is trying to understand what exactly happened, and for us, giving as many clues to the developer, both in terms of on the code side, but also on the user side, what the user has been doing that led up to this error, can all sort of provide helpful hints. So unlike a logging solution, which will tell you, this error happened at this moment, it might tell you details about context when it happened, what happened before and after. And you can sort of grep through things, or you can search through it. Sentry will actually, for example, when an issue happens, obviously the first and most important thing you get is a stack trace, which is exactly what you'd expect, sort of what you'd get in development. Another thing that you guys, that Sentry sort of provides sort of on the code side is for environments like Python, we actually will provide capture variable values so that we can provide sort of here are the values that are actually triggering this error. Perhaps this has something to do with that. If you guys are using a popular framework like Sinatra, Rails, or Express, or Django, one of these extremely popular frameworks, Sentry has native plugins that actually will capture the web requests that were made leading up to the error as well, if that were the case. So there's a lot of sort of code side information that Sentry captures sort of around the error itself, as well as sort of when it happened, how many times it's happened, how many users it affected, all the things that you sort of expect around the sort of quantity and frequency of the error. The other side of this is sort of back to the idea of us, Sentry, providing more clues around trying to solve sort of the mystery of what happened when an error occurs, is actually released something this week called Breadcrumbs, and it sort of plays in the same idea, which is a big part of when a developer or an engineer attacks sort of an error that's happening in production, is you try and sort of think through it, you try and reproduce it in your own development environment. And so sort of in line with that, we produce this feature called Breadcrumbs, which is basically what are the actions that happen either server side or browser side that led up to this error. So on the browser side, for example, so Sentry is available. You can use error logging both client side, browser side, mobile games, whatever you'd like. So on the browser side, what breadcrumbs does is say where in the page did you click, what XHR requests were made, all these sort of events that led up to the error itself. So did you call a third-party API that returned an unexpected value because the API was down, or it just returns something that your code didn't expect? And if that happens, and you then have an error later on, that all that information helps the developer diagnose like why the error actually occurred, how your application got into this very strange state. So that's sort of like those are the sort of ideas around what Sentry does. There are a lot of other features that we provide that are sort of all in line with this sort of central idea, which is when an error occurs, you want to be able to quickly triage and sort of understand the error and then try and get to a fix as soon as possible, instead of sort of having to think of interesting logging queries that you can sort of put together and think, oh, maybe this is why it's happening. And you sort of poke around and try and reconstruct events yourself. So
Eric, it's a really quick question for you on this.
Totally.
That's all. That's super awesome. Do you have some examples of this? Are you going to go through examples showing how we can do this kind of stuff? Or
yeah. I'm going to do actually maybe you're right. Maybe the best thing for me to do is actually just intersperse this with like sort of actual view of Sentry itself. So let me do that. Stop share. So next, I'm going to walk you guys through sort of like what the UI of Sentry looks like and how you can actually do that. Let's see. Share screen. Okay. So can you guys see sort of this is the issues layout of Sentry?
Yep.
Cool. So it's sort of like when you use Sentry for Python, you immediately sort of get a bunch of events, and almost every organization that signs up for Sentry, you immediately start getting a ton of errors that you didn't realize were happening, and you can sort of see how many times it's happening. And this is actually Sentry itself. So this is errors that we're seeing in production. So for example, like right here, you can see like when you click into one, you immediately get that sort of like stack trace that you'd be used to in Python. And sort of like you can see on the right side here, when it starts, like you can see frequency of when it's happening. We first saw this error 6 months ago. It's actually not, I think it's an error that actually has more to do per message. But you can see right here, like we also can tag it with release. So with the idea of releases is that like when you release code, we usually use git SHAs, but you can also use like, 0.8 release, 0.9 release. Effectively, you can start to trace back what diff produced this error. Like when did this first start happening? And you can also see that a lot of these tags, we actually don't actually tag it in the client configuration itself. They're just automatically captured. We use a backend of Django. Obviously, Sentry is totally open source. So you can look at our code anytime. The idea of like what environment we're in, the tags like, what server this was on. And you can see down here, packages that are installed, the additional data, like for example, the path, the process that was running. This one doesn't have the variable inspection, but we can dive into another one real fast. But this one does have the idea of breadcrumbs. So what SQL queries, and this is on the back end, mind you, that not the browser side. What were the sort of SQL queries that were run? What web requests were fielded by this particular Python thread? All of the things that led up to this error. So you can sort of see what happened prior to this error that led up to it, and of course the stack trace to try and drill into the actual line of code that is throwing the error. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so a lot of these errors, like these are captured by the framework. Are there ever any times where you go and manually make calls to log specific things like errors or info or debug or anything like that? Is that something that people usually do?
We do see people do that sometimes. Usually what happens, people do that in order to be, people will manually capture. So our clients are called Ravens. And so Raven.capture exception, you can throw our sort of custom messages. However, people usually do that because they want to sort of tag extra metadata that isn't otherwise naturally captured by the client. The important thing to note is that Sentry is not a logging solution. If you're looking for just doing pure logging, we are probably not the best solution for that. It's going to be, we're a comparatively poor search for just manual grepping like Splunk is, or like Elk. Those tools are indispensable for most engineers. The thing that we really do best is the ability to sort of capture things automatically and capture errors that you didn't anticipate. And so if you can anticipate the error, oftentimes you usually have an idea of how to like resolve it, or you know that it's not that important to solve today. And so you can sort of pass, you can do a try and catch this particular type of exception and sort of let it pass. The other case that we see people use sort of manually capture errors is for sort of raw Python, raw JavaScript, where you're just wrapping your entire code in a big try and then catching and throwing the exception, throwing all exceptions that were thrown by this block of code to Sentry. And this is particularly true in sort of like cron jobs where you don't, if you're not using RQ or Celery or I forget what the Ruby and Express ones were, but if you're not using some framework or library around it, you're just running raw cron jobs, you can just wrap that cron job in a try catch and catch it with Sentry instead of just logging it to a file, and we'll capture that perfectly well. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah,
does that answer your question?
Yeah. I just didn't know if there's certain cases where you do want to capture something, like if inject an error, like logging somewhere, or at least tracking some information somewhere. So in terms of Node, you guys have an agent for Node. I've seen that. So that does that work on top of Express? Because most of our projects are in Node.
Yeah. So we support, basically, if you go to getsentry.com/platforms, we support a ton of platforms. We have plugins for Node and for Express in particular. So we basically can hook into Express's middleware and just capture all exceptions thrown by the Express framework. Okay,
cool. So in terms of like, you kind of showed the view there, like, is this something we can use to find out, like how would we basically say, what's the biggest problem in our application today? Like, is that kind of what you use that dashboard for? Like,
yeah, I mean, usually sort it by sort of like how often it's happening, or the scope of impacts, or how many users has it affected, and and then from there you also can sort of assign responsibility of what engineer or like usually what engineer is going to sort of attack the problem. You can also, we obviously have integrations with, sorry, Sally, you did send me the list of sort of tools that you guys use. I don't have it up in front of me, my apologies. Do you guys use an issue tracker?
Yeah, we use GitHub for most of our issues.
Oh, great. So we actually provide, we have a GitHub issues integration as well. We can sort of one-click create GitHub issues that link back to the stack, the Sentry issue, as well as include information about the error. So you can sort of project manage still within GitHub, but still be able to assign work within Sentry. So actually, I see there's a couple of questions on the questions page as well as in the chat. I'm going to jump into those, and then I'm going to jump back into the presentation real fast. Chad, oh, cool. You've used it since PHP. We actually just released some new Monologue and Laravel clients last week. I'm actually really excited about the PHP community this year as well. So if you guys are still using PHP for any side projects, we're pretty committed to them as well. It's pronounced Laravel, right? I've never actually met anyone in person.
I've always called it Laravel myself. Yep.
Okay, cool. Question is Node.js support. Answer is yes. Question is Jira support. Answer is yes. We have Jira support, as well as if you use Bitbucket issue support. Essentially able to extract error info from raw text, or do you need to send highly structured logging? You can from raw text. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. In terms of like, are you sort of capturing the exception and converting it to a string and then converting back? We do, for example, for client-side JavaScript, most of the exceptions themselves, sadly, despite how far browsers have come, the exceptions are thrown in like a lot of browsers in terrible ways. Just like, for example, raw JavaScript strings in some browsers. And we do sort of normalize that. There's actually a open source library that we both use and actively contribute to, I believe called stack.js, or maybe it's trace.js, that sort of normalize that across browsers. Node.js can be tricky about error throwing handling. Support for that? Answer is yes. Breadcrumbs, something that requires manual integration. This is actually super important. Breadcrumbs, just like a lot of the other framework support that we provide, are totally free. And when I say free, it means that you don't need to configure it. The reason why we think breadcrumbs are powerful is because you don't have to configure it, because you cannot anticipate most errors. If you could, you probably write code that would work around it. So you are actually usually using breadcrumbs in a moment where you have no idea the error is going to happen, and the sort of breadcrumbs step in to save you. You can, of course, just because for the same reason our client API is open source, you can, of course, modify the clients such that you can insert your own breadcrumbs. But that is usually pretty rare, and for that you usually will use tagging instead of breadcrumbs. Email and SMS notifications built in the core. That's absolutely true. Email notifications, PagerDuty notifications, Slack, HipChat, the whole deal. Integrations with analytics. We do integrations with, I believe, Segment. I don't believe we have any that we maintain for Mixpanel or Amplitude or any of those, but they may have built integrations with us, as Sentry is a 7-year open source project. So a lot of times the community has built a lot of integrations for us. Breadcrumbs are not available for all platforms. We have them for Ruby, Python, and JavaScript today. We will work to integrate them into Node over time. Eventually iOS. We are actually mostly actively working on supporting symbolification or DSym support for iOS today. CI support. We do not really do CI support. You can include Sentry in your build process if you need to, in terms of like letting Sentry know that a new release has been created. But for the most part, it's not super relevant. Pipe support to local machines. Not sure what that one means. If whoever can ask that can sort of clarify that in the chat, I would really appreciate that. In the meantime, I'm going to continue with the chat, the quick presentation. I'm probably off to a slower start than even I anticipated. So I will try and keep up at a good pace. All right, setting up Sentry. Oh gosh, this is where I switched immediately back to a browser view. Sorry guys, this is awful. Share. All right. Setting up Sentry is extremely straightforward. So for GitHub, if you would like to follow along, I created a very, very tiny, incredibly basic demo app, Express app. But if you go to just our docs, they are by and far the most informative. If you go to our docs, you can always look up all of the setup processes. But if you go to sort of github.com/getsentry/demo-express, you can just see exactly what it takes to set up Sentry for Express. You literally just require Raven. Of course, you npm install Raven. You require Raven at the top. You then you define an on error function where you sort of throw it, you sort of mention Sentry. You add Sentry to the Express middleware, and you attach we call this our DSN, which is basically an API endpoint for your project. that your project will submit errors to Sentry with. You actually in real life and this or in production and best security practices, you would never include the DSN in the code base itself, just like you would never include any API key in the code base. This is simply there for sort of like simplicity, for people to understand sort of what it takes. But you probably include it in the environmental variables, and you would then just grab it from the environmental variables so that the API key is kept in memory. And then you add it to the request handler, you add it to the error handler middleware, and then you start running the server. That's it. That is literally all you do. If you would like to additionally configure Sentry to be able to do release tracking, to be able to do user tracking, so that you know what release created, like what this error was first seen in, or how many users this error has affected, or if you'd like to send custom tags, that part is insanely easy as well. Literally, you just raven.config and you pass it a sort of configuration object that can include release, what kind of logger this is, server name, any sort of tags that you want. On the JavaScript side, for example, you can whitelist URLs so that you can sort of ignore any URLs, any tags, any errors that are being thrown from URLs that are not your own. And this is really super relevant for when you include third-party JavaScript, as most anyone does, sort of be able to filter out the noise and filter out like sort of errors that you literally cannot fix. All right, so back to the next thing I want to talk about is sort of, I guess we already talked about server-side stuff. Or server-side, so Sentry is used both on server-side and client-side. A lot of times what will happen is actually people use us server-side first, simply because that's the easiest one to get started with, and usually server-side errors are the most glaring. But client-side errors are actually a huge part of why people sort of value us, especially for the hosted model. As you guys probably already know, Sentry is totally open source. Like, you guys literally can all run Sentry by yourselves. All of you guys can flip me the bird today and run Sentry 15 minutes from now. The pip install is insanely easy. But a huge part of why people use, what we provide basically is hosted Sentry, just like a lot of our sort of competitors. And a lot of the reason why people are big believers in Sentry is because of the open source model. It means that we don't get to bullshit you guys, because you guys always can take the code home and just run it yourself. It's BSD licensed. And also it means that you guys can look at our code. If you guys have concerns, if you have feature requests, you're able to introspect the code deeply. And we're huge believers that engineering should never, ever be blocked by anything that is basically business process oriented. So if we never want an engineer to have the experience of filing a ticket with us and us being like, thank you for your concerns, we will take it into consideration, and us basically not really being able to help your problem because, say, you're like a $10 a month customer. And that's what usually happens if you are a small customer with most SaaS products. And I think the huge value of open source is that everyone has the ability to look into the source. Everyone has the ability to contribute. And this is not like sort of a sort of throw it over the wall community. The vast majority of contributions are made by Sentry, sort of like people who are part of the team, but we have hundreds of contributors who contribute small lines and contribute who raise issues and help us make decisions with how to build Sentry. Because a lot of it, we take a huge amount of feedback from the community. So this is incredibly important. And for those of you guys who use open source, like sort of like libraries in your production code, you guys, I'm sure you guys all understand and have sort of understood the value of using open source tooling and making sure that it's something that you understand and control. All right, so next, I think I'm going to walk through a couple of sort of interesting features that we have. I guess I've already walked through quite a few in terms of like release tracking, iOS symbolification, breadcrumbs. Another one I think that is sorry, I forgot that I had been screen sharing the whole time. Another thing that actually is pretty cool is for JavaScript side, we actually do source map just decompression. So if you minify your JavaScript client side, as many people do, for performance reasons, we will actually just automatically decompress if the resources are publicly available. Otherwise, you can actually just privately upload them to Sentry servers, and we will decompress the minified stack traces for you. So instead of engineering, giving these tiny gibberish stack traces that are basically pointing to the one line position, like line 1, position 972. It actually is the full stack trace that you come to expect. And like you can basically, for example, if you're using React, you're using JSX files, you can actually get the source that you've written instead of the gibberish that you've minified. I think that's basically it. That's sort of Sentry in a, well, not a nutshell. It's a 30-minute nutshell. But I guess at this point, I'm going to start answering questions again. But if you guys have additional questions, if you guys think I'm a terrible bore and would like to tell me, please tell me now. All right, let's go. Rob asks, do you have any way to look at group errors on things like user ID across requests? Yeah, absolutely. This is basically, so errors themselves are grouped according to what we think, they're similar errors basically. If you'd like to artificially group errors, like we're not doing a great job of doing the grouping, you can actually include a thumbprint with an error and we'll coalesce them all into the same Sentry issue. What I believe you're asking is basically you would like a way to search across like Sentry issues and see all the issues that were affecting this user in this project. You actually totally can. Sentry search is actually really, really awesome because we, of course, allow you to search, and I'm going to flip into the share screen moment here. Sentry search allows you to do, obviously, like the obvious cool thing, like being able to search across like environments, like errors that happen in an environment, like sort of the default tags that we automatically include, whether error is unassigned or resolved. You can sort of see a list, like does it have a tag, what user sort of agent sent this error, so was it what version of Raven, what browsers triggered this error, was it like a Chrome browser? You actually can search across for like users, so I'm going to search for user, you just type user.email, you can search for, I'm going to search for my coworker Ben at getsentry.com, and just like that, you can see all the errors that have affected that Ben has basically hit in the last 90 days. And Sentry does 90-day data retention by default for all of our tiers. I know our pricing page for our lowest tier says 30 days, but it's actually too much work we just rather hold on to the data. It's easier that way. Basically, you can search it across that way, or if you'd like, you can search across user.id. Another interesting thing that we actually do is like if you provide custom tags to Sentry, we will actually index those. So you actually can type, I actually don't know what our custom tags are, sadly. I am sadly out of date with this. Let me take a look. So if you click through here, we have project. Oh, that's actually a good one. So Sentry, when you create Sentry projects, we actually create IDs on the back end, as would probably make sense. So you can search for all errors that affected this particular project. And this is a custom tag that we made up, and we have not done anything on the server side to configure this. So basically, you can search by any custom tag that you send to Sentry. So that if you'd like, for example, to search by client ID, in addition to actual user ID, you can actually do that as well. Cool. I hope that answered it. All right. Rob says cool, so I assume that I must have answered it, hopefully. Cool. Let's see. Going back to questions, are breadcrumbs traceable by client session details, as well as general application details? Traceable by client session details. I'm not quite sure what the question is asking. Could anybody help me with this? Chad, do you know? You have answered this already. Oh, okay, cool. Thanks, Ryan. Okay, cool. I don't think there are any other questions. Forgive me, it is 9 a.m. and I'm an engineer, so I still go to sleep very late. I promise someday I'm going to be able to wake up and normal. I'm going to be a business person someday, I promise. All right, cool. You guys have any other additional questions for me? Oh, yeah.
Daryl, did you have anything else that you wanted to make sure that we talked about today?
No, I think kind of covered a lot of it. I mean, we do use Node and Express mainly, so you kind of covered that. Is there any time when you find like errors for some reason aren't getting into Sentry, or you want to log other things? And like we kind of talked about the manual logging already. But those agents capture pretty much everything. I guess they might not capture like server crashes or things like that, or maybe they might capture things just before crash.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it is important to know that Sentry is application level error tracking and not like when server crashes. So for something like server crashes, you're going to want to use like an actual like monitoring service, be it like you might be using like Opsy if you're using AWS, or a Datadog for metrics on the actual server side. And these are great tools. We actually actively recommend using them in addition to Sentry. Sentry is purely for application logging. I think the cases where we've seen people have trouble with sending errors to Sentry is, one, of course, we have a quota system. So if you are paying for 50 events per minute and you go over that, we obviously will start to drop the data until the next minute arrives. But usually people understand that, and we provide notification when you guys are over quota. I think the other tricky thing is people do actually have a lot of trouble with browser configuration, particularly because browser side errors can be so multiplicative, because if you have, say, like even a modest application might only have 10,000 users any given minute, and if an error is being thrown with every single page load. Say you have a very innocuous error that isn't actually causing huge troubles for the application, but is nonetheless being thrown by the JavaScript. It actually will totally wipe out your entire quota immediately, because suddenly your application will see tens of thousands of errors every single minute, and they'll consume your quota within the first half second, basically immediately. So a lot of times when implementing JavaScript, it is something that is worth like being sort of thoughtful about, and sort of like we're happy to help. If you email us, we'll walk you through the sort of configuration that we have. We've built in a lot of stuff into our JavaScript client around making the client be able to send as much signal rather than noise as possible. And we're very sensitive for client-side Sentry of making this possible. Aside from that, most of the time people use Sentry, they're using some kind of framework, be it Express or Sinatra or Django. And so we really do, I think, a great job of capturing everything from there. And if it's not being thrown there, most people basically, if you're doing it for cron jobs or for celery jobs or like basically background tasks, usually you just wrap the entire thing in Sentry. So usually you're able to capture things pretty easily there. And so I think that resolves it, I think.
Yeah, the thing that's interesting to me is the variables, like on the requests and things like that, because like in normal log lines you don't get the context around it, right? So when you do a post, like I guess like if it's a big binary file or something that you're not going to get the post data, but do you get the post variables from a form and things like that in there?
Let me try and see if I can find a great example of this.
Yeah.
So the variable inspection is actually something that is per runtime, sadly. Python actually has and David can speak very much more deeply into this than I can, as he's been doing this for 7 years. That's our founder. Basically, the Python runtime is exceptional at providing variable introspection at system for application crashes without producing a huge performance cost. A lot of things like Ruby, for example, we don't do even though we have the capacity and we know how to do it because of the performance cost. I'm not actually sure for you guys, for Redis, it might be the case that we are not able to do that for you guys, but let me do my best at this point to try and find you guys an error that provides some idea of what this looks like. But for Express, for example, we absolutely, for GET request, post request, we definitely will capture any data that we can that is naturally provided by the Express framework. This is actually a perfect time for me to talk about data scrubbing as well. So that's something that we're obviously super cognizant of the fact that we're integrated into your application, and there's a lot of PII that is sent into an application. So we actually do a lot of work to scrub that. Anything that looks, smells, walks like it is a password, credit card information, any sort of personal information that we don't, as Sentry, want to be storing. We absolutely do not want to be storing, because it's not going to help developers resolve the problem, and it only produces additional security concerns. We will actually automatically scrub that, and there's a data scrubber that you can check in organization settings if for some reason you would like us to be sort of storing sort of things that look like PII, but by default is enabled. You can actually also define any fields that are PII. So if, for example, you guys decide to name your credit card fields instead of naming a credit card, and instead of storing it in a sort of a normal sort of like four-digit block, and you store it as something like CC_client. You can just list that in your organization settings, and we will scrub that whenever we see it. So at this point, I found a decent looking error in Express. So I'm going to share something with you guys. This is This is from my shamefully primitive Sentry demo project that I showed you guys earlier. The github.com/getSentry/demo-express. But you can basically see this is an example JavaScript exception. Actually, sorry, this is not it. This is, so right here. This is where I'm artificially throwing an exception. You can see we capture IP address by default for users, so that that way we can sort of count. Oh, this affected a various user. The exception is me literally throwing an error. Not terribly intelligent, but for demo purposes, it will suffice. And then here's a lot of the stuff that we capture by default. The GET request. What were the sort of headers? What was the environment? What packages were installed? You can sort of see what the CSRF token, the session ID, all these sort of information around the requests. And this, once again, zero configuration. This is me writing Express code for the first time in my life, I think for maybe 15 minutes last week as you guys asked for a demo. And we actually have the ability, you can replay the request, or we have this little thing right here where you can actually just curl it again if you'd like to test it, just to be able to test it in dev, just to see if you fixed it in dev. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that'd be super helpful. And I think the other request you were in there as well did show a post with query strings and stuff, which was interesting too. So
yeah, that's sort of the JavaScript side. So we will do what's possible to capture on that side as well. I am actually not terribly sure what our progress is on Express and Breadcrumbs, as Breadcrumbs was literally released. Oh wait, it was released last Wednesday. Sometimes I forget what day it is. It was released last Wednesday. So it's, I think at this point, 5 days old. We obviously are actively working to expand it across all platforms. So Express is going to be obviously next on our docket list in terms of seeing if we can support Breadcrumbs for Express.
okay, and if we're using something like Restify or other frameworks that you wouldn't have a plugin for, or do you have integrations for Restify? Do you know?
We do not have any official plugins for Restify. Node module built around it. No, we do not have any existing plugins around it. Let's see if
we would just use Raven kind of manually there.
Yeah, for that you probably want to use Raven manually.
Okay.
If you guys, and this is sort of something that we see, for example, Opera Software built a CLI tool to use with Sentry. They open sourced it recently. If you guys do end up building a client, definitely please open source it, contribute back to the community. Literally, a lot of our early clients were built by the community. We see if there's we see a lot of people using them. They're starting to send with them to hosted Sentry. We do track this, and so as we see demand for it, we definitely try and support as many as possible. Our team is exceedingly small. We have about 13 people. Almost all of whom are engineering. So we have 9 engineers, 2 designers, and 1 office manager. So our team is extremely lean and very engineering focused. So whatever we can support, we're definitely happy to support if we can. Do you have an approach for building clients for frameworks that are currently not supported? Absolutely. So within Sentry's docs, let me screen share. Boom. Cool. Within Sentry's docs, you actually see there's a client API, and we actually walk through what it takes to write a Sentry client. We actually Sentry also has an API for building tooling. So, for example, if you'd like to sort of pull down all of your data and store it somewhere else, or if you'd like to do have custom triggers like webhooks, for example, that trigger for certain particular types of events that you'd like to ping other servers with. Very, very, very easy to do with Sentry. Cool. All right. That sort of leads me to the end of my presentation, guys. I think I also have addressed most of the questions that I could find. Hopefully you guys have found this useful.
Thank you very much.
No problem. I'm Eric at getsentry.com. If you guys, I just put it in the chat. If you have any questions, be it on my official role at Sentry is I do more of the sort of growth oriented engineering. So if you guys have questions about sort of the billing model of Sentry, any sort of questions about support, definitely email me. Or if you guys have questions about the actual engineering of Sentry, support for various platforms, you can either email me or support@getsentry.com. You will immediately, all of our engineers answer support questions directly from the queue. So you'll immediately get to literally the person who wrote the client or the person who's been supporting it for the better part of 4 years. So if you guys have any questions, definitely ping us. We're happy to help.
Thank you, Eric, very much for your time. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure you're going to get plenty of emails from us over the next few weeks.
Cool. Yep. All right. Well, hope you guys find this useful. Open source, hosted, whatever you guys prefer. We're always just happy to sort of make a tool that is being used by as many engineers as possible.
All right. Have a great day, guys.
Good to meet you guys. Bye.